We're live. Okay, folks, we will gavel back in for the afternoon portion of our second day. Pretty light agenda. Obviously, we got the lien registry discussion done this morning. On the agenda, we've got the data privacy, property rights, and the digital identity components. It's fortunate that my co-chair is really sick, because this is one of the big things that he's been spearheading. And oh, is he? Mr. Co-chair, are you online and able or to participate? Or are you still unwell?
I'm well enough to participate. So happy to
We'll take it.
be here.
David, did you want to come up and present first, or Chris, or do you want to just jump right into it, or Mr. Co-chair? Dave, maybe it's, yeah. Go ahead, start with you.
Mr. Chairman, David Hopkins with the Legislative Service Office. We prepared just what's titled the Data Privacy Bill Draft Outline. This document is more really for discussion purposes. This committee took a kind of a detailed look at data privacy about 2 years ago in 2021. Reviewed the California's data privacy laws, a brief look at what they've done in Europe. As well as Virginia and Colorado. We did have a bill draft based on what Colorado had done. But ultimately, the committee decided at that time not to proceed with that particular legislation and kind of tabled the discussion. So this is coming back around. I don't have a lot specifically prepared for this topic. Because I wasn't sure what direction the committee might want to go with that. And we're happy, of course, to prepare anything in more detail that the committee would like to take a look at. But since Chairman Rothfuss is here, I'd defer to him on how he wants to proceed with this discussion. I'm happy to kind of walk through those points in that outline if the committee would like me to, but otherwise that's.
Mr. Co-chair, do you want to jump in, or do you want David to maybe walk through it a little bit? Or maybe we lost them.
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me? All good?
Yep, we got you. You're good.
Okay, sorry about that. So I can talk a little bit and then maybe have David go through the outline, but the concept, as David noted, was the Consumer Privacy Acts in other states are just that. They're about consumer privacy, and what we found was that they were very limited in scope and really only applied to certain major internet companies and certain major companies that are social media, et cetera. And as a result, they probably didn't capture 99% of the relevant areas where you might want your digital identity protected. They were also all constructed based on kind of the California Consumer Protection Act model, which assumes that you are a consumer and that's the only circumstance in which you would need or want protection. So the intent here, and kind of the intent of the outline, is to take a different approach to drafting it and to see what it would look like as an outline if we drafted it from a digital identity standpoint, a self-sovereign digital identity standpoint, that was focused heavily on the privacy rights and the property rights of the individual and was broadly applicable and that required express written consent. So it would be a much stronger form, but would take a lot of, I think, work on our part to really be thoughtful about how to implement it in a way that wouldn't have unintended consequences and wouldn't hinder commerce in the state, but would provide appropriate protections. So this little walkthrough is kind of how that might look as a discussion point about the different parameters that we would want in such an act. as a starting point, and then they can be fleshed out if this is the type of model that we'd be looking for. So I think the important thing to have happen today is a little bit of a thoughtful discussion by members of the select committee on high level concerns or high level interests that might exist with a bill of this type of structure. And I'll stop there and let David walk through it, and then maybe we can kind of go through and talk about the individual key provisions and see what thoughts there are. And I'm also interested just generally in hearing public feedback and potential concerns of areas that we should be focused on. So I'll stop there and let David kind of walk through the concepts.
Mr. Hopkinson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this kind of just outlined what it might look like, creating a new section 403201 through 206. First one, short title, simple, nothing there really. Definitions in the next section. I include two definitions that were kind of discussed quite a bit when we looked at this a couple of years ago. What does consent actually mean, and what does personal data actually mean? And so those are just kind of there for your consideration. Those are consistent with the California model. Kind of getting more into what the bill might actually do. In 203 on page 2, it could outline, what rights does a person actually have, a natural person have with respect to their own data? And some of the things that we commonly see include a right to opt out, meaning this is in the context of someone processing your data, but you would have the right to opt out, that they can't take your data, they can't use it in that manner, that you would have a right to access that data, a right to correct it, a right to delete it, a right to data portability, just references that you can take that data and find out what they have, what information they have about you personally, in a manner that you can actually access or is portable. And then the right to consent, referencing that someone can't access or utilize your data without your consent. Those are some of the common rights that we've seen. Certainly not limited to those, but they're for discussion. In 204, potential for a data collection or handling requirements, providing prohibitions on collection beyond reasonably necessary, or providing requirements for how that data is processed, secured, and maintained. Again, kind of just some options and looking at how to or what requirements might need to be in place or protections for your data. 205 would just be who exactly does this apply to? As Chairman Rothfuss indicated, the acts that are out there now are generally speaking looking at the larger corporations, over 25,000 consumers, et cetera, et cetera. So they're really limited, Facebook, Google, that sort of thing. Not looking at smaller actors, it just doesn't apply to them. So the question then would be, well, who should this apply to? And what requirements would they have? It also, in a sense, I think depends on how the committee would choose to structure this. Do we provide the protections in a sense to the data itself and not care about what people are doing or the specifics of a corporation, but your data itself has a protection, or kind of the construct that we typically see of limiting corporations or entities that are collecting the data? Just some different approaches that might be used. And then finally, enforcement. And that's just looking at, okay, we've got this law, and if somebody handles your data in a way that they shouldn't or otherwise violates the law, what's the penalty there and who can enforce that? Options such as, the Attorney General, local law enforcement, or civil actions or other criminal actions, or even potentially a private right of civil action, which private civil action is not something commonly seen in data privacy currently. But certainly an option for the committee's consideration. Again, kind of a high level overview of some areas that have been discussed in the past, and just an outline and looking forward on what the committee might actually want to do with respect to data. And of a natural person and their privacy.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkinson. I certainly think at first blush, it looks like a pretty solid outline in terms of something to move forward with. But before I jump into it, Mr. Co-Chair, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, just briefly, Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you. There are a lot of different levels of data collection, data use, and data gathering. And I think that is what is missing from other legislation, and something that requires a different approach to it. Other legislation, for example, doesn't protect the privacy of individuals typically from their own government, their cities, towns, and counties. There's no obligations there. It's almost entirely specific to protection from, as David mentioned, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, etc. And those large entities are monetizing your data, and certainly can be held to a very high standard because they're monetizing your data. The challenge is probably with the smaller companies that might not be monetizing your data, but still, or might be monetizing it to a smaller degree, but still should not necessarily be off the hook and be able to ignore the rights that you see enumerated as an example under personal data rights in this outline 403203. So just because you aren't making millions of dollars off of someone's data doesn't necessarily mean that you should then be exempt from any regulation or requirement of opt-in, access, correction, deletion, portability, or consent. So there are some challenges here. And then there is also the challenge when you contemplate what Christopher Allen has talked about with us for a long time, the self-sovereign digital identity concepts, and the idea that some rights under digital identity look more like property rights and some look more like inalienable privacy rights. And there's no delineation elsewhere among those either. I mean, if I'm looking at my data in certain circumstances and contemplating it as a property right, then whose property does it start as? Maybe it starts as my property, which is reasonable. And maybe I can assign that property right and then opt out of that property right at some point. But the assignment of something which is more unalienable with regard to privacy, some sort of intrinsic privacy rights, would look more like constitutionally protected rights that, again, perhaps should have a different level of scrutiny. So all of these concepts coming together and trying to contemplate digital identity presents the challenge that other states haven't faced, that we should probably be tackling in light of the work we've done on digital identity. And so one of the things that, again, is missing elsewhere is the idea that these rights should be a little more universal than just multi-billion-dollar corporations. But it then complicates it further. Another concept that is not broadly used, but we did it with our Genetic Information Privacy Act in its updated form, was express written consent for a lot of things. So a higher level of consent than just I didn't read the complicated terms and conditions, I clicked at the bottom of it, and therefore I agreed to transfer my soul to one or more social media providers. We can strengthen that, particularly when it's being employed by an entity that is going to financially benefit or share. So I'll sort of pause there, and I'm interested in understanding the direction that other members of the select committee want to go, if there's interest in really strengthening and going out and leading on digital identity and its association with data privacy and data as property. I think this is a good starting framework, but it's going to take a good bit of revision moving forward, and also just to hear concerns and interests and anything else that should be added to it.
Committee members, Representative Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is an extremely interesting topic, and I'm almost wondering if our topic about artificial intelligence and this actually need to be folded together. I think if we're going to explore AI governance, I think one of the most important places to start would be protecting people's personal data. What can an AI find about you? What can it disclose about you? I mean, if we have technology we've all seen on the news where it can generate images based on brainwaves and what you're thinking, I mean, that's probably pretty far away till that's a huge concern. But I mean, what are new ways that data about a person could be accessed, and how can we protect people from that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I
Mr.
may,
Co-Chair.
Representative Andrew hits on, what's on the horizon here with products like Neuralink, which is being worked on, and who's going to own that data, and why? Is that your data? Is that your information? Is that part of your digital identity? And would you have to assign it, or would you have to be informed, or would the assertion be, well, it was generated on our computer, so therefore it's ours, which is pretty much the standard right now in Wyoming. I think if any social media company has information about you, that's deemed their information and their data, not yours, and it is only going to get worse. A training model of a deep fake that operates as an AI of you at this point in time would simply be proprietary, very likely. We did pass legislation about digital identity impersonation, which might come into play. But again, I don't think there's any clarity on default ownership, which if nothing else, saying that under, your data is yours as a first approximation, data about you, data generated by you, for you, of you, all of those kinds of things is your property to begin with, would be stronger than we've got, but even that might not be sufficient. And I think it would get at least to some degree at what Representative Andrew is hinting at. Mr. Chairman, also, we're already in a place where there's tremendous amounts of data that's generated, and we've talked about scenarios in the past. For example, if I'm a business or even a public entity that just spends all day recording license plate information and knows where everyone is all of the time, based on license plates, and so I have your license plate in my database, and I basically have tracking information about where you've been at different times. I don't think there's any barrier to that at this point in time, and there'd be no barrier for that if it were the government doing it also. In fact, governments around the country do that, or they have third parties do it and they buy that information. No problem. And you don't even have a right to know. There's let alone delete, correct, or anything along those lines. If that information is out there and it can be sold, I still don't know that we can't have our Department of Motor Vehicles sell our personal information for retail purposes. We talked about that at one point, and there wasn't clarity. So it isn't just private entities, honestly, that are collecting massive amounts of data and just sitting on them like treasure troves with the possibility of selling them off later with no recourse. It's government too, and they often don't have protections in place. And so if there's a hack, as many of us have probably had our some aspect of us hacked at some point, and I know I certainly have, that information does not need to be well protected, because again, there's no onus on protection of that as my property. It's just treated like, I don't know, secondary information that, maybe I'll get a letter of apology. So I think that Representative Andrew has a strong point about the fact that AI blends into this, and that we need to contemplate the scenarios that we were talking about yesterday in that excellent presentation as we think through how we should be protecting digital identities overall.
Any members? Senator Furphy, go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to explain a personal situation I had, and my concern is my data was broken into, but I never could find out who got to my data, and they were trying to use it illegally. Fortunately, we found out about that. I'll give this example, what happened to me. I get a letter in the mail from a bank on the East Coast, and they say, thank you for depositing with us $10,000. I go, I didn't put that money in there. So I contact the bank. They had my name, of course. They have my social security number, my date of birth, all of that information. And so they opened this account online, and the person who did that deposited a fraudulent $10,000 that was captured from somewhere else. And so fortunately, I called the bank and they say, yeah, we've got all your information. Thank you for depositing with us. I said, you better close that account. I did not put that money in there. So my concern, I'm pointing this out because even though we put these things into impact, we still can't protect everyone. And what I'm concerned about is, how do we protect ourselves in the future so things like this don't happen to us in the future? Sorry for taking the time, Mr. Chairman, but I think it's an important example of what we're dealing with here. Thank you.
Absolutely, Senator Furphy. Thank you for sharing that with the committee. Senator Ellis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a question for my colleague, Senator Rothfuss. When I look at the outline that LSO prepared, I think it's a good start, but where I get really hung up is on the enforcement piece. Enforcement through the Attorney General, local law enforcement, through a civil or criminal action. And so that is the question, is like, what is the criminal action? I mean, we've got to think about Title VI, like what was actually violated with the transfer of information. And then, so that's one thing, an important piece of this puzzle. And then the other part that I'd be curious is just the definition of personal data. And I think of all the algorithms on, social media sites. There is a lot that I think privately, when you're scrolling through internet searches, I love campers. And so I'm always looking at campers, and then I see them pop up in my social feed. If I didn't post anything ever, no one would necessarily know, like the public. And that's maybe not a good example, but because everyone knows I love campers. But, if you think you're doing all this within the privacy of your own searching on your device, but that's actually data that's being shared and marketed. And, is sold. And so I just want to be clear that that's not what you're intending with this legislation, with that definition, is the data about you that isn't your, linked to your social security number or something like that, but just data about your interests and data that is used for marketing. So just your reaction on those, Senator Rothfuss.
Mr. Co-Chairman?
Thanks. On the enforcement side, honestly, that's just kind of a list of possibilities, and there is a lot of consternation about enforcement, and who would do the enforcement. We can have enforcement through the Attorney General's office or local law enforcement. It can be civil or criminal, and I think depending on what the transgression is, you would probably want different penalties, as well as what the level of responsibility is. So you can imagine if you have a company that makes billions of dollars a year off of your data, they had better do things right, and they can afford to do things right, and they can be held to a high standard. So maybe the recourse there is going to be, more stringent or more detailed than it would be if you are a data holder of a small data set and don't make money off of it. I think there is a significant delineation there that we would have to think about. The private right of action, there's a lot of consternation regarding the private right of action because it turns out corporations don't like lawsuits, which is fair. What we had in the bill draft from a couple of years ago, based on the Colorado Act, which was appropriate, was that the opportunity to provide a remedy would presuppose a civil action as long as there were not direct damages, which is a reasonable approach. So rather than going straight to a lawsuit for an action, having an opportunity to remedy it. In other words, I asked you to delete the information about me. You haven't yet, so I'm going to sue you. No, it might be better just to say, oh, well, I'm sorry about that. Here, we're going to delete the information. So that's a little bit of compromise that we looked at a couple of years ago. But again, the enforcement probably ties into the severity of the action. And to the criminal side, I don't know what it takes to get to criminal, but if you intentionally leak, if you intentionally disclose, if you intentionally commit fraud, those kinds of things, tying into our other statutes and making it clear that something would count as fraud or something would count as theft would be a reasonable approach to tie in where we think that's appropriate. Again, not all data mismanagement is going to constitute theft, but there certainly are cases where data mismanagement would constitute theft. So I think there's thoughtfulness that needs to go into that. With regard to the definition of personal data and what would apply, this again becomes very challenging. But yeah, the broad definition, Senator Ellis, that you mentioned, I think is the one that we would want to be looking to. Anything that can be linked back to you is probably appropriate for us to consider. If it's linked to personally identifiable information or can be, which is an alternative standard, sometimes entities will anonymize their data set, but with another data set, you can determine who the identities of that first data set were. So you haven't really accomplished anonymity, and that is still personal data at that point. But certainly your profiles, the fact that you do like campers, and that it's linked to you is going to qualify as personal data. But if it were truly aggregated and anonymized, for example, if you have a data set that indicates that there are 3,000 people in Wyoming that really, really like campers, then that isn't necessarily going to be considered as personal data. So this definition is a strong one that I know has been used before, and I don't know whether David got it from the Colorado or California, but the intent is to try and make it broadly usable. At the same time, we may want to expand it and or refine it if we want to be more inclusive. And I don't know that it would count things like an AI data set that was tailored to a specific person to create deep fakes of them. I guess that would be reasonably linkable to the identified natural person, so perhaps that would qualify. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Senator Ellis, any follow-up? Any further thoughts? Representative Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my question for you is, under this definition, does a photograph that isn't generated by the user but by another user qualify as personal data?
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you. So it's a great, Mr. Chairman, it's a great question whether we would want to cover that or not. And under what cases we might, and what is fair use. If I take 1,000 pictures of you, do you have rights to that data, or to make me get rid of that data if you choose to have it deleted? How would it work if you're a public figure versus a private figure? So there's, I think, an interesting discussion and debate there. And a good example of this is, at this point in time, when you go shopping at any of the major stores, the bricks and mortar stores that you might go buy a lot of groceries and other things from, you're being surveilled in association with your cart, right? Massive surveillance. Purportedly, that's for the purpose of, fraud and theft prevention. Nothing says it has to be used for that. So what if I am using that information to generate additional information about individual preferences, to know which specific person is doing something, to target for advertising, or to use it to train adaptive AIs for deepfakes? Whose data is that? And should we protect our citizens from unwanted, unauthorized use of that type of material? And then at the same time, there is the compelling interest for that data of, well, it's being used for crime prevention, and that's reasonable. And it's a use case then where you can easily justify that holding it for a certain amount of time for that purpose is reasonable. At the same time, we do that for our public agencies, where our public agencies will have pictures of you, videos of you. And do you want them to have that in perpetuity with no rights over that data? I think that's all subject to our decisions and how much privacy we want to protect, how far we want to go. I think at this point in time, we have very little privacy realistically. So we can probably go a long ways in the direction of improving privacy before we're at risk of going too far, would be my guess. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Singh, follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a thought. I recently read that there is facial recognition technology being used for airport check-ins. That's an experimental technology that we're starting to see roll out. And so would this Data Protection Act require that any AI that has our face stored in it require that entity to relinquish that information?
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, again, we could construct it that way. We could say they could have reasonable use for it, but not sell it, not resell it. As an example, not use it for anything other than its intended purpose. I think there's a lot of room for us to think through those types of scenarios. Whereas right now, again, I would make a lot more money if I were selling that information for third-party purposes that would be a great business model. It would not be expected by the person that was being surveilled, but I could make a lot of money off of that. And do we want to allow that without express written permission? Also, I can't imagine there's any protection requirements on that. So liability is pretty trivial if I'm the collector of that information and I get hacked and lose, 10,000 people's facial imagery so that I can build deep fakes. At most under statute, you might have to report to the individuals if you knew their names. And then you might have to potentially provide a little bit of consumer protection for a short period of time, because there's no real damage associated with the loss of privacy. It's not a quantifiable damage most of the time. And as a result, unless we are explicit, we don't have any course of action for an individual that would lead them to think it was worth their time to protest. And again, I say this firsthand, like Senator Furphy, I can't count the number of times my information's been hacked, and this was entities that were making money off of my data for the most part, and then the federal government Office of Personnel Management lost a tremendous amount of my information in their big hack about 15 years ago. So what the recourse for all of that is nothing more than the federal government pays for a little service, which may or may not tell me if something like what happened to Senator Furphy happens to me. So there isn't really an associated value with that. And honestly, it's an interesting discussion. If you just put liability associated with data ownership and it was real, like if we quantified that it matters that your information was hacked, if we're talking about Wyoming citizens and you lose their information, that matters a lot. That would probably go 90% of the way to ensuring that bad things wouldn't happen, because then they'd have to take action or give you the opportunities to get rid of the data if you don't agree to it. Good discussion though. And, Representative Singh, I'd love to hear your thoughts and kind of where you're comfortable with, or any other members. There's no bright line and no state has a perfect solution. We are, like many states, we're kind of tied for last place because we haven't taken any significant action. Only a few states really have.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Representative Singh, do you want to weigh in?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, my initial thought with all of this is I'm very concerned about the status of the Fourth Amendment and the protection of our individual citizens and our individual rights. And as we quantify what data is, and if it is private property, then just how protected should you be from both a corporate entity or a political entity from being able to harvest your information, and just the different layers of that. How far does that protection go? So that I'm actively thinking about that.
Thank you, Representative Singh. Mr. Co-Chair, I got a couple of thoughts, but I wasn't sure if there's any more that you wanted to weigh in on. You're good?
No, Mr. Chairman, I just kind of want to hear what others are thinking, because we need to craft something that we're all comfortable with, how far it goes, and not wanting to go too far, but wanting to go far enough that we're providing some meaningful protections, and also recognizing that this is a new drafting direction relative to how other states have done it. But I think we can capture a lot of what other states have done. I guess one other point I do think it's important to note: we don't exactly as a state have a lot of clout when it comes to forcing large corporations to comply with our statutes. It would be very easy for a large corporation to just say, well, we won't operate in Wyoming if we have to adhere to this, whatever this is. So a lot of what we do with regard to corporate engagement probably needs to fall under the umbrella of the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Protection Act, and or Colorado's. But those are really pretty good and broad for consumer protection against large corporations. It's just honestly other entities that they don't do a good job at all on. And we need to think of how we would allow, or how we would structure something so that there still is an obligation for a smaller entity, but without necessarily being as punitive or requiring an easy user interface. A good example of that, which we've heard concerns before, is, you know, if I put together a mailing list and I'm a business, and I've got that mailing list in my drawer and your name's on the mailing list, and it's got your address and other personally identifiable information. The other consumer protection acts would basically say, you're not big enough, we don't care what you do. Well, that's probably not realistically fair. I mean, if I wanted to go in and say, take my name off your mailing list and show up in person and do that, and they can get the mailing list out of the drawer and delete my name, that seems reasonable. But at the same time, putting an onus on them that they have a web-enabled user interface to allow me to automatically remove my name from their mailing list when they don't even have a web-enabled user interface probably isn't reasonable. And I think that's where it broke down in other places, where maybe we can do a better job and say that everyone's got a certain obligation. You've got an obligation to adhere to good practices of data management. But there would be recognition that until you achieved a certain level, you know, the draconian fines might not be out there, but standard access to, I don't know, small claims court for compliance, who knows what it would be to get compliance, is still reasonable for a small actor. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I think I think conceptually it absolutely does need to happen. I think Representative Andrew did raise a valid point where it's the kind of PII that AI can use to create this kind of stuff, deep fakes, the like, et cetera, whether that be in video or image or audio or whatever that may be. I also think kind of the certainly part of the component that in this discussion, I think in general, is, are they monetizing it? If it's me, I've got a small business and I have a surveillance camera out front for security purposes and it catches Representative Singh walking by. Okay, I don't think that's probably super applicable here, but you know, if I am the big tech giants and I take all of Senator Ellis's surveilling of campers and available campers and try to monetize that, I think that's just that's the scenario I have in mind, or I think that there absolutely does need to be that set of rights and that component there. And I agree that I think the California Consumer Protection Act probably does not go far enough.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, on that point, which is a really good point, if you're an individual business owner and you've got that surveillance camera, I mean, maybe the trigger point that's reasonable is if you sell that data, you've just entered a different category. If you're using that data, maybe you're in one category. If you decide to monetize that data, you have shifted categories. And at that point, your use case doesn't require a whole heck of a lot. That's it. It's a good concept. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, I agree. I think, I don't know if LSO, if that'll be easy for them to make that delineation in terms of words on a page, but I think that's a really important one as well, whether it's, and again, the type of actor, the little business that, you know, like, let's say some camera vendors will say, and I know this just from the facilities that I own, hey, we'll buy your data back from you so we can use it to improve our product, which, you know, I think that's a smart proposal, right? But I think that's a whole different level of consideration, but a distinctly different type of actor than, again, the Googles who just do it, you know, at a scale that's just almost impossible to comprehend. So I think making sure that delineation is in there in terms of, you know, recourse for the folks, you know, for the average folk, which is, you know, that's a big part of who we're trying to target. Mr. Hopkinson, does that make sense? Are there any other committee members Want to weigh in? Representative Andrew, go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to, I think, something Senator Rothfuss, Co-Chairman Rothfuss, touched on earlier, is he mentioned that a lot of this stuff is focused on commercial activity and rather than your relationship with the government. I guess I think maybe we should broaden it to that scope of what the government can know, what data the government can buy from these sources, and what the government can know about you. Because at that point, the public can know about you. I guess, I mean, I like motorhomes rather than campers, but I don't care if Facebook knows that as much as, you know, if the government is using my image to basically know my location at all times via biometrics. So, I mean, I think that's more of a concern for me and probably a lot of people than, you know, what private companies do for marketing. I also, you know, I like seeing the ads for certain products that I want to know about. And I think a lot of people do. And a lot of the stuff that's come out where you got to press the button and give the permission and all that is actually more annoying than helpful to me. And I don't know, I think a lot of people feel that way. I don't know if we looked at the percentage of anyone who's actually read any of that, it's probably extremely low.
Senator Ellis, go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just kind of building on this narrative of how we think about this, because we were talking about the AI, you know, how you can put someone's face on maybe a different body and with the intent of maybe embarrassing that person. But then you're like, well, does the intent have to be embarrassing? And that's really subjective. You know, if somebody put me in a clown costume versus in something provocative and then shared that and disseminated it. So, you know, I think there's elements of libel and slander and defamation that we could talk about. So all of those require an actual harm. So that's something we could think about. But I think on the identity and privacy, the thing I struggle with is if you look at, you know, under Title VI, the definition of theft, it's taking property from another person, but it's a big hook in this is that you're depriving that other person from being able to use their property. So if someone steals my car, they're depriving me of the ability to use the car. And so on what you own as your interests, your likes, what you monitor on your Facebook, or sorry for using the proper name, you know, your interest in campers, am I deprived of that if some other entity sells that to someone else, that knowledge? And so that's one thing on the definition of theft, just trying to find that hook to tie it back into what law was really broken. If we do go down this path, we need to be really thoughtful on making sure that those all tied together. But at its core, I think that's one of the things I'm struggling with is, you know, the harm. In both of those instances, what is the harm to the individual by that data being shared or that image being generated? And on the AI front, you know, your intended audience, is it how, you know, how we treat explicit images of children? You know, if you share it once, like that's where you've broken the law, or do you have to share it to a broader audience? I don't know, or just the existence of it. Does that do the harm? So I don't know, lots to think about. I'm just throwing a lot out there.
Senator Ellis, I think those are good points. And I think we also have to be kind of careful, not careful, but just a lot to take into consideration in terms of, again, the commercialization component that we've been talking about, right? Versus the actual governmental component of government buying this and how they use that data versus kind of the libel and the slander component, right? We've talked about. So I think, you know, that's something I'm certainly trying to keep in mind when it comes to trying to actually get something that we can move forward with. Senator Ellis, go for it.
Thank you. And then one last thing on the government discussion, Mr. Chairman. You know, I know that there's always concern about us as individual legislators putting information on social media pages and a question of whether or not we are quote unquote the government when we're speaking freely on our individual platforms versus, you know, a deliberate agency action. And so I can think of instances where you might have, you know, a certain sitting legislator who knows that there's a candidate running to replace them in their seat. They support that candidate. They give them a list. Hey, here's what I know about my neighbors. I wrote down, you know, this person, here's their interest. This is their political leanings. Here's this list. It's going to help you when you go knock on doors. That's to me, that would be covered by all this. So, you know, would that be looped in if we try and parse out the government, quote unquote, part of this is just, are we the government when we're just individual legislators doing our thing?
Community members, anything else for Mr. Co-Chair?
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, thank you. You know, I think Senator Ellis did a great job of elucidating some of the reason why we haven't been able to pass a bill yet just now. It's a really hard topic to thread the needle on, and there are always exceptions that come up that we'll have to work on. And again, I don't know that we need to be perfect. We should probably try and get something in place that's the right structure, that goes in the right direction and doesn't take us down in an inappropriate rabbit hole. And that was always the concern with, I think, how other states have done it, was their model was not based on an individual's identity. Their model was based on corporations and consumers. And that was sort of strange and awkward. You weren't sort of granting rights to an individual. You were creating this odd corporate structure. So it needs to spring from that individual's digital identity and the legislation that we put forward in the past. And I think that is a helpful approach. With regard to the government discussion that Senator Ellis and Representative Singh raised, you know, there are different levels of what the government is noting and registering, and it probably needs to work differently than what the requirements are perhaps for a commercial entity. But at the end of the day, I think there's probably a general sense that a surveillance state, a passive surveillance state, is not something that we would like to see enabled. And we can go a long ways to just saying that, you know, no government in Wyoming is entitled to passively surveil as one of the privacy protections, and accumulate that passive data without, you know, having a specific target, a targeted warrant, and can't sell that information. So any information they require, and maybe they have, I don't think we have in statute anywhere retention policy requirements on passive data either. So there's something that perhaps we could move in the direction of what Representative Andrew and Representative Singh mentioned, and try and address that passive surveillance aspect. But again, getting into your actions as a consumer, your actions just as an individual, and where obligations begin. You know, natural person obligations might be different from corporate obligations. And perhaps this gets to Representative Singh's question. You know, if I personally take a picture of Representative Singh as a person, does that have maybe that's now my property because I took that as an individual, but maybe if I then sold that to a corporate entity, that corporation now has to adhere to privacy standards and respect that right. You know, that's plausible. I don't know whether it's a good idea, but it's certainly something that could be considered.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I think the discussion we've had this far has arrived very much at the point that we've come to in previous discussions about just how darn complicated this gets really quickly. However, I don't want, you know, I think we're all good, solid personal data rights advocates here. I don't want us to go down the road of defeatism, that it's too big that we can't at least make an attempt. So I do think moving forward with this in some form, whether we focus on strictly the commercialization of the data from non-state actors, or we want to go the other way and maybe try to address the scenarios that Senator Ellis had mentioned. I do think moving forward with something, though, makes sense. I would prefer the commercialization component because I think it makes the most sense. And obviously, I simply, you know, big tech does need to be regulated, and any step in that direction I think is beneficial.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and that might be the clearest and brightest line to start with. And we can structure this, maybe if we intentionally structure this so that it's not a complete product, but that we're accomplishing tasks along the way, then we have as the who this applies to concept if you monetize personal information, something along those lines, then here is a set of requirements that you would have to adhere to. And have that, work through that threshold. And at that point, it can be very similar to what we already had drafted that David worked on for the Colorado Privacy Act, where we took that into Wyoming statute. Most of that might apply. And then we can just set it to the trigger for when this applies to you is, if you are monetizing or selling this data or using it for commercial purposes, it applies. And then maybe have two tiers. One is basically you make a lot of money, and the other is, de minimis in some way. That might be a way to at least get started on the commercial path. And then honestly, maybe the passive surveillance legislation can fit as another puzzle piece in the same area, or maybe that just goes somewhere else in statute where we can curtail passive surveillance without warrant. Warrantless passive surveillance by a government entity is not a thing, or put limitations on it. Oh, Mr. Chairman,
Co-chair, I think that's a,
what
sorry,
other,
go ahead, please.
sorry, I had one other thought. The other thing to get at, Senator Ellis's question about the harm associated with theft of property. One thing that we can also do generally, and this might be a simple, well, it might be short, but maybe not simple, Bill, is to say that at a minimum, your data is your property. But that does not obviate any Fourth Amendment privacy protections. So at a minimum, it's your property, but it may be subject to further protection. And at that point, at least it allows it to tie in to theft, but it might not address Senator Ellis's concerns about, well, what's kind of the harm there of lack of use. But it could be argued that, if you're selling my digital identity information for $5, I can't sell it for $5. That can be, albeit trivial, a harm that would motivate a class action suit. Just some thoughts. Thanks.
Mr. Co-chair, I think that does make sense that just, what's the old saying, keep it simple, stupid, just say, hey, your data is your property. Obviously that there's still a lot of gray area there. There may be a lot of questions left unanswered, but I think it can be a good starting point. And also, quite frankly, makes me feel good. At least the statutes say that data is mine.
Yeah,
I think it might be. Go ahead, Mr. Co-chair.
I think that goes a long ways, but I would just note that data as property suggests that it's fully severable, and that is a concern that Mr. Christopher Allen has raised, that if we're explicit on that, it might have bad unintended outcomes that diminish your actual Fourth Amendment privacy rights, because you've decreased its standing from an inalienable right status to a property status. So I think we need both. We need to make sure that at a minimum it's treated as property, but that it doesn't diminish any rights through other privacy right standing. So I guess it's just key that we make sure that we don't erode privacy rights accidentally by making them property rights. But I do agree that might be a simple addition to our statute.
Mr. Co-chair, I think that's a good point. I'm sure if Mr. Allen is watching, I'm sure Mr. Maher is probably chomping at the bit to hop in on this one. I'm sure some great comments, but before we open up to public comment, was there any further questions or comments by the committee? I do think, again, just given how nebulous and broad this topic is and how complicated it is, I think we need to take the approach of, how do we eat an elephant one bite at a time type of thing, the same way we did with a lot of the crypto stuff and digital assets. It wasn't one bill. It was, I mean, just look at the list, a couple dozen at this point. All right, let's go ahead. It's 2:36. Let's go ahead and open up to public comment. Let's go ahead and start.
Hello?
You said Mr. Maj got his hand raised?
Hello? Am I on?
How we doing? You are on and we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Oh, great. Thank you, committee members, for having me here for such an important topic. And I should note a few things logistically. First, we have Daza Greenwood. I know he's waiting in the channel. He's not really sure if his hand can be seen through Zoom, so please make note of that. And I'll try to leave room for him and others. As many of you know, my name is Brendan Marr, for the record, and I am on the data privacy group. I'm a Media Lab alum, you all know that. And we worked on this, Daz and I worked on this for, I think about, must have been 7 months or so the year before. We went through every single line of the California Act, and it was abominable. And the fact that we brought this down to 2.5 pages means that Mr. Hopkinson deserves a Golden Scissors Award. But in all seriousness, there's a lot here, and I want to point to some things to think about and some very clear paths forward that Representative Western and the committee members may want to consider in terms of how to tackle this tremendous body of work. So first of all, I think it is very important to have a deep understanding of the way and nature in which data is changing and how it's stored and how that's changing. So the original California Act was intended to be this big monolithic act to hit and target large centralized corporations like Facebook, etc. What we're seeing now as we move into this new economy and this new Web 3, is a radical transformation in how information is stored. Quite simply put, it's easy to understand. You can't store information on the blockchain; it doesn't fit. So it has to be stored somewhere else. And these storage mechanisms are decentralized storages such as IPFS and others. Amazon, all sorts of companies are gearing up for this. The important things to consider are that first, in terms of anything related to opting in and opting out, all of these things should certainly have considerations for dealing with these things, through cryptographic signatures. The other thing to consider is that this is a large problem, and it was raised the ideas about artificial intelligence, how artificial intelligence plays into all of this, and it certainly does. And one of the ways in which it will play into it is in terms of where data is stored and how it's processed. So instead of data being pushed up to these centralized companies, there's going to be data which is stored on these decentralized servers, these decentralized storage mediums, and people will have their own wallets in which they cryptographically control the data that is theirs. And this is a very different methodology of control. And it raises the opportunity, a tremendous opportunity for Wyoming, if we get this right, to be an enabling legal vehicle for individuals and small business entities as well, to enable them to monetize their own data. Because in Web3, everybody controls their own data, and this is radically different than the traditional centralized methods. The other thing is that also plays into the ideas of how data is processed with artificial intelligence. Data can remain on your phone, and the algorithms can come to the phone and do the processing there. So there's a whole lot to consider here. And in painting a path forward, how we can actually begin to tackle this. My strongest recommendation, and I'll be quick and short on this, is that instead of trying to tackle the whole thing at once, we look at it very, very discreetly in the smallest pieces, and essentially do an exploratory sessions on that, and looking at one, how does all this play out with data that is on decentralized storage? This is a very big thing. It's a very different model. No other state is looking at this. There's probably not as many people who have the expertise to really, look at this both from a technological and legislative viewpoint, but we have that expertise. We've gathered that expertise in Wyoming. So storage, decentralized storage would be a starting point just to begin to understand that. And then the other thing would be, of course, the ideas around liability and harm that were mentioned. Those are all very, very important. And of course, the third large one is artificial intelligence and how it plays into all of this, because there's quite a number of different things here. But we can allow individuals to monetize their data, and that would be a tremendous enabling win. So instead of it being about data protections, we can start looking at these technologies in terms of data enabling. Just like healthcare, everybody's got all this healthcare information. If they opt into to sending bits and pieces, I'm not saying that they do healthcare, but other things. We have all data that we can monetize if we think about this very carefully. And I would hope that DAZA has quite a bit more to add, and others. Thank you very much for your time. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Real quick, before we pull DAZA in, one of the things you just emphasized was just the data on decentralized servers as a starting point. Maybe expand a little bit on that in terms of the delineation between, again, the centralized concepts that we're used to and some of these decentralized, and what is the difference from a regulatory standpoint in terms of legislation?
Sure, that's a great. One way to think about it is that if you have some data, you have this is the case, this is operating, this is how things work, right? In Web3, you have NFTs, you have metadata about the NFTs or whatever. It doesn't have to be an NFT, it can be any data, any kind of thing you can put in binary, right? You take that information and you upload it to a decentralized server, right? And when you do that uploading, you get a hash back. It's a special form of a hash. Usually if it's IPFS, it's called a CID. But it's basically a hash, which is a representation not only of what the data is, but it's simultaneously a representation of how to get the data back. And so how to fetch it. And so that's fundamentally very different, right? So that's how you put the data up there. And then that little hash thing, that gets bound into a transaction in your blockchain transaction, right? Or it gets bound into a smart contract, into one of the registers or addresses of the smart contract. So that information of where it's located and how to get it is wrapped into a blockchain. And that's essentially what's going on there.
Brendan, if you might, just for clarification, so you're saying that because if we're using the decentralized server format, you get that hashback, which is kind of sort of a serial number-ish, at least for the context of this discussion. And that brings an element of traceability that you don't get when you upload data to traditional servers. Is that a fair statement?
Well, when you take it all together, you get a whole lot that you don't get with traditional servers, right? So when you take data that you upload to Facebook, you're just giving them data, right? You're giving them the your image, you're giving them the raw bytes of the pixels of that image and any other metadata, and you're sending that to them and they get it. You know, in these other models, these centralized models, what you're doing is you're taking your data and you're uploading it to these decentralized servers, and the data is going there and you're getting a hash back, but you know what that hash is, so you know how to fetch it. And when it is in a when that hash is bound into a smart contract or in any other manner where it's put on a blockchain, it's then accessible. So the blockchain acts as a mechanism of control, right? Because along with the blockchain is the process of cryptographic signing, right? So just like Bitcoin, right? You just because, you know, because something is put on the Bitcoin blockchain or Ethereum blockchain doesn't mean that anybody can access it, right? Because then we wouldn't be able to have, you know, any secure trust around money, right? So there's access controls built into the blockchain protocol, right? That's what the blockchain is, right? So when we think about these ideas that are being applied to money and Bitcoin and how they get applied to data, then we realize that just as people can control their own money through blockchains, they can also control their own data through their own wallets, and the same wallets that they're using to control their Bitcoin, right? So when you start to think about all this stuff, you scratch your head and you realize that, wow, everything we know about the way the whole world works just kind of breaks down. Now, does that mean we throw the baby in the bathwater out? No. You know, there's still many large companies. There's all these legacy databases. I'm not saying that we don't deal with that. I'm not someone who, you know, believes that, you know, we have to give up all that or we have to get rid of all that. It's not going to happen overnight, right? But beginning to understand and peel back the onion, as Senator Rothfuss was alluding to earlier, will get us to better understand, you know, little pieces of this, the storage component part, the AI component part, the harm part, the liability part, and the other part that was around, you know, control, you know, government agencies, whatever, potentially. We need to look at this problem at this lower component level to understand it more, to learn it better before we dive into writing legislation. I think, and I have to say, Mr. Hopkinson's paring down of the monolithic California Act was monumental, and it was a tremendous job of what he did. And I'm not saying we don't use that, but we need to take this little pieces at a time and understand it much better. I hope that is helpful.
Thank you, Brendan. Mr. Hopkinson, congratulations on your Herculean task. Thank you very much, Brendan. We could keep going, but I think we're starting to run up against the clock a little bit here.
Please bring Daza in.
Is Daza, is he? Right there. All right. Daza, we can see you. I think we can hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to echo Brendan's remarks that this is an excellent outline, and it's achieved what I haven't seen before in state law on this topic, which is it's simple and it cuts right to the main points. So I do commend the drafter and the select committee to look at this draft seriously as a starting point. I would say three substantive things. The first two based on the conversation of the select committee that's just happened. In terms of the first is in the relationship between individuals' private personal data in the hands of private sector actors versus government actors. Please take a look at Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 66A, which is the Fair Information Practices Act. And it was a law very similar to the outline that's being put forward before the committee. And it only applies to personal data that resides within the state government of Massachusetts in that case. It was enacted in '74, I believe, as a reaction to perceived government overreach after Watergate. And it's clean. It's very on point. And I think it shows, although it's all but been forgotten as an example of how state governments can treat personal data, and the rights of people whose data they have. It's not, a common approach. I think it's a very good approach, and it's right on point what the committee was asking about how to apply these same rules, or at least comparable rules to state governments. The exceptions end up being a little different. The second thing is, I do encourage taking a second look at the personal digital identity definition that came out of this select committee, because it provides an interesting dividing line between, on the one hand, all the personal data about a person that's out there and over which we should have some rights, and on the other hand, that subset of personal data that actually is our identity. And just to quote the definition, it's that subset through which we take actions and we communicate. So that's when we start getting into the type of deep fakes, where I didn't know I wasn't talking to John Smith or whomever, or that this wasn't a communication sourcing from them. That is personal data. It's identifiable, but it really kicks up a notch the types of rights a person should have. And that it's on the personal digital identity side, or the subset of all that personal data, where I think rights such as it should be inalienable, not something people can sell or have, expropriated from them in some way. That's where I think those sorts of rights occur. The next thing I wanted to touch on was the idea of property. I think there's a common belief that our personal data isn't also property, and I don't share that belief. And I think even from a privacy and due process perspective, we can look back to the founders and the U.S. Constitution, Amendment 4, specifically extends protections to our papers and effects. Stuff in our pockets, and our personal items of property. That personal property would be the best legal description of a person's relationship to our papers and effects, and the protection against unreasonable search and seizure absolutely applies to those. What happens when those are digital? Almost all my personal effects are digital now. My papers are digital. A lot of my stuff I have laying around is digital. It should apply. And so I think having a property overlay is helpful in terms of all the whole common law and statutory state law rights about personal property, but it also does extend to privacy and due process rights as well. And I think it's entirely helpful as a floor, not as a ceiling, as Senator Rothfuss mentioned. And finally, most importantly, I would like to implore the committee to consider adding a little clause, which you'll also find in the California consumer CP consumer, their CPPA, that to recognize the role of something called an authorized agent. An authorized agent is an entity that helps consumers exercise their rights to access their data, to delete their data. There's a number of them that exist today. It's very difficult for a consumer or a person to go around to hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of companies and find the right thing to click on to exercise the right to access data or to correct data. It's all but impossible, and they're all Byzantine and different across the companies. It's also difficult for the companies to comply. Having an authorized agent that's sort of in the business of connecting a consumer request to a bunch of companies in a business to business way is a really effective way to implement and deploy this at scale so people can meaningfully exercise their rights. On that score, there is some draft language that Consumer Reports has that includes model language for authorized agents. And I should mention, if you want to see it in practice, please take a look at datarightsprotocol.org, which is a common standard that I've actually been working on with a bunch of authorized agents and a bunch of businesses to have a standard way that authorized agents can help individuals execute their rights at the speed of thought using a common protocol, so that it's faster, cheaper, better, and more effective for everyone. Better for businesses to comply, and actually possible for citizens to exercise their rights. So those are my remarks to the committee, and I'll just end by saying kudos on such an outstanding outline of a draft that cuts right to the point. I don't know if I've ever testified that I've loved something before, but I love this draft.
Thank you very much, Daza. I mean, I think you raised a lot of really good points. Certainly, I guess that is not in that draft or that kind of outline that we're looking at, the concept of those authorized agents. And I think that's an important one because the vast majority of people are not nearly as technically sophisticated to a level that's needed to really exercise this stuff, and having that kind of agent can might be helpful. Committee, any questions for Daza? Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it and all your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Emily, who else do we have? Is Bill Fortner, is he still in the waiting room? Okay, let's go ahead and bring in the next person that has their hand raised. Oh, he is? Okay.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can. In fact, it might be a little bit too loud.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and have you speak.
This is Bill
Sorry, go ahead,
Fortner.
just
And
real quick, if you wouldn't mind.
pardon me?
Bill, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you. It's a little loud. Is there anything on our end that we can do, or?
I can turn
That's
my
kinda how
speaker
we're
down
using
here a
it.
little bit. Does that help?
That's good right there.
Okay.
Bill, obviously, I know who you are, but if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself.
My name is Bill Fortner, chairman of the Wyoming Constitutionalist. And I have to disagree partly with what the last person said as digital property, because in geofencing, that actually takes information right out of your wallet as you're going down the road, right off your cell phone as you're going down the road. So actually, they are taking your private property off of your person and out of your vehicle as you're moving. And so the Fourth Amendment covers this subject really well. And I think everything that we can do to pertain to the Fourth Amendment, so more cemented to the Fourth Amendment, is the best option. Personally, my best takeaway on the whole thing is to if the best prevention is elimination. You know, if you don't want the best way to protect it is to prevent. If you don't want somebody to have your digital information, then don't let them take it. Don't let them have it and a trade for a service, you know. And if they do, like Senator Office said, maybe a one-shot deal, maybe they have to have your consent, and they can never be sold, traded, or bartered in any way. That would be the only way, you know. It's a long ways back to the 1780s, 1790s when the founders set this stuff up. And I can see having to move a little bit on the Constitution, but not to the point that we're letting geofencing just totally rip us off as a community, and the people that come and go from Wyoming, they're getting ripped off as well. And once they figure that out, I don't think they'll ever come back to the state of Wyoming. So if you're doing it to promote tourism, I think it can kill tourism just as fast as you're promoting it once the people really find out what's going on out here in the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative Fortner. You know, once a representative, always a representative. It's good to see you in front of this committee. I know you've got a lot of passionate concerns about this, and I agree. The Fourth Amendment is paramount. That's making sure we are protected from unreasonable search and seizures is really important. So thank you. Committee, any questions for Mr. Fortner? Bill, how are things up there in Campbell County? Are things nice and green?
Nice and green, lots of rain, putting me out of business right now. I'm a commercial weed sprayer, so I'm getting plenty of time off.
That's good. Well, again, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
thank you for your time. Thank you for the great job you're doing. Thank you for tackling this beast. I really appreciate it. We need this fixed as fast as we possibly can get it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you. Emily, who do we have up next? Okay, Mr. Edmondson, we're going to let you in. Just in terms of committee protocol, please introduce yourself and who you are representing here today.
Yes, sir. Chairman Rothfuss, Chairman Western, members of the Select Committee. My name is David Edmondson. I'm TechNet's Vice President of State Policy and Government Relations. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I know the day has been long, so I will be quick. I just want to share TechNet's interest in working with you all and the entire legislature as you contemplate introducing data privacy legislation next session. Our Denver-based executive director actually covers Wyoming, Ruthie Barco, but she is out on maternity leave right now. She will be back before the end of the summer, though. So TechNet's position, we advocate for a federal privacy standard that brings uniformity to all Americans, regardless of where they live. But in the continued absence of a federal standard, we do encourage state legislators to look to legislation already passed in other states in order to create a unified standard and ensure interoperability. We are particularly concerned about the impact of a patchwork of policies across jurisdictions. This year alone, a number of states have introduced comprehensive data privacy bills, and so far this year, 5 bills have passed their states' legislatures. There's a lot of similarities between the bills, many of which are reflected in the outline that was shared for the committee meeting. One thing I do want to focus on that is a similarity between on those bills is the importance of not including a private right of action as a means of enforcement. Excuse me. TechNet believes that enforcement by a state's AG is preferred, and private rights of action and other tools to encourage litigation should be avoided. We particularly advocate for a right to cure in order to allow those unintentional violations to actually be corrected. Under a private right of action, any unintentional violation could result in ruinous liability for companies, particularly the smaller businesses that may be subject to the act based on how you scope it. Managing personal data requests are operationally very complicated, and so accidental good faith mistakes like unintentionally omitting a category of data during a consumer request that can occur. And so it's our position that the goal of enforcement should be compliance. And so central enforcement by the AG with a right to cure ensures that justice is meted out evenly. But speaking on behalf of Ruthie, I know she looks forward to working with you all when she gets back. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edmondson. Are there any questions for Mr. Edmondson? Thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate it. Is there anybody, Emily, who else do we have? Oh, that's right. Yeah, let's go ahead and let's let her in, please. Ms. Bonder, can you hear us okay?
Oh, I had to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. If you wouldn't mind helping us out a little bit, is it Bonder?
It's
Pronounce your last name?
Bunder. Yeah, my parents gave me a hard time with the name Kara Bunder.
Kara Bunder, thank you so much. If you wouldn't mind, state your name for the committee and who you're here on behalf of.
Sure. Thank you, co-chairs and members of the committee. My name is Kara Bunder. I am State Policy Director at the Computer and Communications Industry Association. CCIA is an international not-for-profit trade association representing a broad cross-section of communications and technology firms. Similar to Mr. Edmondson, who testified prior to me, we support the enactment of comprehensive federal privacy legislation to promote a trustworthy information ecosystem characterized by clear and consistent consumer privacy rights and responsibilities for organizations that collect and process data. However, we do appreciate in the absence of such federal privacy protections that state lawmakers are attempting to fill in the gaps. So today I'd like to just offer some high-level recommendations as the committee examines this important topic. So the first would, echoing what Mr. Edmondson had said as well, existing privacy law recognizes a core set of rights and protections, but minor statutory divergences between frameworks for key definitions or the scope of obligations can create onerous costs for covered organizations. So we would encourage lawmakers to reasonably align any newly created framework with existing definitions and rights in other jurisdictions' privacy laws. We'd also ensure that business have an appropriate and reasonable opportunity to clarify the measures that need to be taken to fully comply. And based on recently enacted laws in other states such as California, Colorado, and Virginia, those states allowed for 2-year delays in enforcement of those laws to allow businesses and other covered entities to come into compliance. And the last point I'll touch upon today is that the draft does indicate that the bill may allow for a private civil action. Since lawsuits do prove extremely costly and time intensive, we'd be concerned that these costs would be passed on to individual consumers in the state, which would disproportionately impact smaller businesses and startups. Also would add that every state that has established a comprehensive consumer data privacy law has opted to invest enforcement authority with their respective attorney general. And this allows for leveraging technical expertise, placing public interest at the forefront. Along with that, we would recommend including a cure period of at least 30 days to allow for actors who are operating in good faith to correct any unknowing or technical violations, reserving any other lawsuits or enforcement action for those who are acting in bad faith. I'd like for you also to consider CCIA as a resource as you work on this important issue, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bonder. Members, any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate it. Emily, do we have anybody else? I think in the interest of time, this is Chairman Co-Chair Rothfuss. Is he still with us? Okay. Might have some quorum concerns otherwise. Brendan, I really appreciate your passion on this. I think we're supposed to end here in about 25 minutes and we still have to kind of work bill draft requests. So I think I might, Brendan, hold off at least for now. But if you do have additional testimony, please feel free to email the committee. We obviously really value your input and your expertise on this one. So let's kind of move on to potential bill draft requests. I know we covered a lot these last couple of days, but I do think that there's some stuff that we might, some direction we want to give to LSO. As I've mentioned before, and I know the co-chair has, we want to be as specific as we can to give them, make their job easier. Mr. Co-chair, do you want to hop in? I mean, there's a couple things I was thinking about, but want to give you a chance to say something as well.
Why don't you go ahead and start, Mr. Chairman?
Well, kind of going on our conversation from this morning from Mr. Kaufman's, concerns around just amending our unincorporated associations for those nonprofits. Trying to pull up my notes here. And they were basically, my takeaway there, there's two main concerns that they had. It would, or the two things they want to have that would be helpful to be amended into our statutes. And I think that would be a relatively easy and straightforward request. Committee, do we have any thoughts on that one? I mean, I think specifically it was, and Mr. Kaufman, you might need you to jump in. It was one of the big things was amending into our statutes. I think it's Title 17 was not wanting a test for in terms of the minimum threat, or having a test where the doubt is or is not, having that minimum threshold. I think it was 500 is what was mentioned. And then the other thing is the prohibition on profits being distributed to members.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, I think that the comment about the 500 members, so there's a general rule in securities laws that if you have more than 500 non-accredited investors and more than 10 million in assets, or if you have more than 2,000 investors, you're automatically deemed to be a publicly reporting company under the Securities Act.
That'd be Reg 8.
There's nothing we can do about that at the state level. So I think that was just a conversation tied to the component of categorizing a DAO as an unincorporated nonprofit association for the purpose of limiting distributions to remove the securities aspect from that characterization. So I think all we're looking at doing is just some potential slight modifications to our existing act to be accommodating for a DAO structure under what's existing in Wyoming law.
David, if you wouldn't mind weighing in, what more specifications do you need in terms of directives?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to make sure I'm understanding then, you're looking at amending Title 17, Chapter 22. Is that?
I believe that was the one when I was looking through that made the most sense, unless there's unless there's
Yeah.
something else.
Bear with me, I don't have the
Sure.
statute up, but I think that's right.
I think I just had it pulled up here.
Yeah, 1722, is that what you said?
Yep.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so a couple questions then on that. Is the intent to create a new DAO supplement specifically related to the uniform unencumbered, well, Chapter 22 there? Or did you want to incorporate or expand the existing DAO LLC supplement in some way to accomplish this purpose? I can just see a number of different ways that we could go about this. And as far as those specific changes that you want to see in that statute, I don't know if you'd already looked at some potential language suggestions there, but certainly anything you have would be helpful.
Yeah, so Mr.
Go
Chairman, I think with respect to the approach, subject to the co-chairs, my recommendation would be a third option. Let's just amend through a separate bill, the existing Unincorporated Association Act. So there wouldn't be a supplement and it wouldn't be to the DAO LLC supplement. It would just be a standalone bill with updates to the existing statute. That's first, but secondly, yeah, I think we because Texas has a very similar Unincorporated Association Act and they're currently going through this process right now. I think that's a easy place to start is what they've done. So David, I'm happy to provide to you a couple of drafts that are floating around with Texas in particular, but would be very specific as to I think what you'd want to see.
And Mr. Kaufman, if I recall correctly from this morning, which it's entirely possible that I'm not, but it was having language in there that prohibits profits from being distributed to members. I have not checked if that type of language is already in Chapter 22. But Mr. Hopkinson, maybe that's one thing to include as we move forward with the draft.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know off the top of my head if it is either, but we can look at that. And Mr. Hopkinson, I'm happy to work with you on getting a draft together for the next meeting.
Excellent. Committee members, at least for the new ones, usually we're pretty laid back and chill on the blockchain task force, at least for these bill draft requests we've normally just done. Chris, have we normally just done a voice vote or what do you think here?
Mr. Chairman, honestly, we have rarely voted. It tends to be consensus. If anyone's objecting to something, stand up and object to it and we'll work around the concerns is kind of how we've always done things. So if anyone has any concerns about the bill draft or wants it a specific way, we've been a little bit informal about it, although we could make it as a motion if we chose to. And Mr. Chairman, briefly on this, the one thing I think we should aspire to do is similar to what we did on Uniform Commercial Code. If this is uniform law, which it sounds like it's uniform law, trying to minimize changes to existing language and add additional paragraphs, so to speak, so that we're not changing what was already there, if we can get away with it, but adding new caveats. And I'd ask Mr. Kaufman, since I wasn't there for the morning conversation, is that plausible, or are we going to have to actually change uniform language?
Mr. Chairman, I'm gonna have to think about that and get back to you. I just don't know this act quite well enough off the top of my head to tell you how much of that language we might need to change. My recollection from studying a few of the other draft bills is it's not really I mean, there's not a lot of changes to the structural components of the act itself. It's more definitional changes and then a few additions. So I think it can be done relatively simply, but I just, yeah, I'll get back to you on that, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and thank you, Mr. Kaufman. So members, are there any heartburn concerns? Representative Singh? Representative Andrew? I think we're good. Let me circle back one last time to you, David. Any other directives or things we need to give you more specificity on?
Not with respect to this request. I think I got enough to get that going.
Keynote was this request. Another thing we had kind of talked about was the Mr. Rebel, that what our options are in terms of our, trust and bankruptcy procedures with the commission. Yesterday, I'd mentioned the possibility of some kind of working group. Bill, what are your thoughts on something like that? Because I think it would probably require at least one. If we did a working group of 3 people, it'd probably require at least one good meeting between now and the next one to try to put together some type of template to move forward. What do you think, Joel?
Yeah, maybe worth checking in with Chairman Rothfuss, who I think we had some preliminary conversations about this topic as well. I don't know if a working group is necessary, but happy to get some resources that I know have spent some time thinking about this.
Sure. Mr. Co-Chair, what's your temperature on this one?
Mr. Chairman, I was thinking about this last evening, and I do think that we should have a bill draft for the next meeting and plan to have that bill draft for the next meeting with regard to our discussion on clarity of banking and trust assets for bankruptcy, and to work with the Commissioner in the Division of Banking on that. But I do think that putting together a little informal working group to review that a couple of times along the way is an appropriate approach. So I think both is the right answer, and we'll get Mr. Reville and maybe Senator Furphy with his banking background can join in on that one, and anybody else who's interested, just to go over it, maybe iterate a couple of times to make sure that we're comfortable with it. But I think there's plenty of time, and it should be a pretty short bill. So yeah, I think it's appropriate for us to expect a draft for next committee meeting on that.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. David, along those lines, what questions do you need to have answered to let's get you pointed in the right direction?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think just by having kind of that working group option there, and being able to work with the Division of Banking and with Mr. Reville to clarify exactly what their concerns are, we can get that done. So I think the direction is enough for now.
Excellent. Members, any heartburn over that one? Oh, sorry, Mr. Reville.
Yeah, sorry, I just thought of something that may or may not be helpful, Mr. Chairman, which is that in his testimony yesterday, Commissioner Bishop referenced the fact that Wyoming already requires that assets held by trust companies or by non-bank institutions be kept in legally segregated accounts, and they may not be commingled with the balance sheets of those firms. And I think the idea here was to try and further clarify the state's intentions should there be a failure of that institution, that any bankruptcy court that looks at this would know that the intentions of Wyoming was that these assets would be kept segregated and returned to customers. So is it that we just need to build on it? Whatever Commissioner Bishop was referencing, is that an existing statute that we just need to build upon, or do we need a fresh cut at this? Was the idea I had, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Go
I
for
can
it.
address at least a little bit of that. I did get an email from Nick and I'm gonna butcher his last name, Rochadel. And he highlighted 135409. Which deals with supervised trust companies and their financial transactions, specifically paragraph or subsection A, which provides that every supervised trust company shall keep all trust funds and investments separate and apart from the assets of the supervised trust company, and all investments made by the supervised trust company as a fiduciary shall be designated so that the trust or estate to which investments belong may be clearly identified. So that was just one that he highlighted. I don't know that that's the only one that we might need to tweak, but adding a sentence there that says, you know, in a bankruptcy proceeding, et cetera, this, you know, and kind of, it might fit right there. That's just one possibility that was identified.
Mr. Ravel.
Thank you, Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hoskins. I think that was the statute that I was thinking of, that the commissioner referenced yesterday. And in addition, there is a carve out, and I don't know if it's in the statutes or if it's in a rule somewhere, that permits the bank commissioner to opt out of receivership and instead go to bankruptcy with the assets. And so that would be a second place where if possible, perhaps some clarifying language that does keep the customer assets separate in the event of that, or that it is the intention of the state of Wyoming that those assets be deemed as legally segregated accounts and not clawed into a bankruptcy estate.
Thank you, Mr. Ravel. Yeah, that was kind of my thought, would be a bill draft along the lines of clarifying intent under these scenarios. If it does go to a bankruptcy proceeding, that is the intent that these assets are to be isolated and segregated and not included as part of the trust company's assets. And who even knows, have some sort of remittance right of there in that language. Mr. Ravel.
No, I had nothing further. Thank you. I don't know, Co-Chairman Rothfuss, we had a couple conversations previously. I just want to check and see if that's in alignment with what he was thinking. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Mr. Co-Chair, what are you thinking?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, exactly. I honestly think in both the banking section and the trust section, it probably needs at most minor tweaks, but then an additional paragraph in each place that indicates that clear intent under any circumstance to honor the separation of those assets. And I think that's probably the best we're going to be able to do, since we're not capable of binding federal bankruptcy court. But if we provide explicit intent in statute, hopefully that will go a long ways with them in terms of allowing for that separation.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, one more thing that just might be helpful for the for LSO is that there, as I referenced yesterday, Switzerland has some language that makes very clear that this exact issue, and it was further it was amended I think last year to include digital assets, and I can get that for you to the extent that language is helpful, but it's specifically in bankruptcy proceedings, custody assets are not part of the bankruptcy estate, and that extends to digital assets.
Mr. Hopkinson, is that sufficient for you? Okay. Let's see.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I have a quick question on that, and it just regards to potentially strengthening it, since states have authority over property law. I would assume that a federal court that was going through bankruptcy proceedings would honor state property law, and maybe there's a way that we can phrase that to reiterate and make it clear that all of that not only is not an asset, but is explicitly the property, perhaps, of the owner of the asset, or something along those lines. There might be a way for us to use our our property authority to further strengthen it. Just an idea in drafting. I don't know whether that'll go anywhere or not.
Mr. Hopkinson, is that something you can at least include? All right, excellent. Mr. Co-Chair, were there any other potential directives or bill drafts for staff? For also,
Mr. Chairman, I think getting back to our digital identity discussion, working on this kind of simple first build approach that we discussed of a lean draft that talks about that property and privacy concept, and then includes some of the basic core that is in the outline as a first approach is worth working on. So I think we should have a bill draft, but once again, with that, we would definitely want a working group where anybody interested is we're happy to include on putting that working group, that draft together. And then we could also consider as a separate draft, one related to the state. I think the suggestion that DAZA put forward to look at the Massachusetts legislation that I hadn't reviewed before, but the idea of explicitly enumerating rights with regard to an individual's privacy relationship and their data relationship with the state might be worth doing also. So again, perhaps we put together a working group that has as tasks those two bill drafts, kind of the consumer data privacy and protection and the public information data privacy and protection as their tasks, and works on those with an eye towards our November meeting. But if we fail, we fail, and we'll just sort of go down that path and do our best. And I'm happy to continue to work on that and move that forward with anybody else that wants to participate.
Mr. Co-Chair, I think it's a good idea. I think maybe adopting the model that we used for the unincorporated organizations approach, where we can have maybe David get the draft going and periodically check in with some of these folks, so that on our next meeting we've got something that is at or near what we were looking for. David, would that be helpful for you as well, taking that same approach?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know how much the committee would like to take a look back at the Wyoming Data Privacy Act that was provided in 2021, because there was a bill that went up through version 6. But there was obviously a lot in there that wasn't liked and more that wanted to be put in, but that would probably be the easiest starting point to take a look at and have something concrete for the working group to consider. Because it's essentially, I think, what I'd be putting together based on the conversation that we've had.
Dude, was that the digital identity, the one that we passed into law, or was this?
It's a different bill. I can send it.
So I guess then the question becomes, do we move forward with that as the vehicle, or the outline draft that David put together, or both?
Mr. Co-Chairman, I think that the content of that previous draft that David put together fleshes out the outline if we fill in kind of the parts and pieces. And I think going for the lean approach with the outline as the core, and then taking into consideration some of the concepts and suggestions on how we should maybe narrow the scope in the beginning, it is an appropriate starting point. So kind of a blend of the two, but there's no question that we've David's already put together some great language that is appropriate for the state of Wyoming through that Wyoming Privacy Act from a couple of years ago. And so it's a good place to start, take the pieces and assemble them, I think, more consistent with the outline that was presented today. That'd be kind of the direction I'd suggest taking a look at. And for the first meeting of a little working group, I mean, we can take both of them and have that conversation. So I think both of them have meaningful and useful components.
David, was that helpful?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my understanding on that then would be we'd get a working group together. I'd send out both the outline from today as well as the latest version from 2 years ago on the Data Privacy Act, and then the working group could consider those and kind of pick and choose what we actually might want to incorporate into a bill draft. As far as a starting point goes, that's my understanding. I just want to make sure that's where we're at.
I think that makes sense, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Sounds perfect.
And maybe one other thing to include there that certainly made sense, and Mr. Co-Chair, maybe weigh in, or other committee members. I did like the idea of at least at face value that curative period of 30 days, 45 days, including that kind of language.
That's in there, David.
Mr. Co-Chair.
So, Mr. Chairman, we had extensive conversations when we were drafting that bill with the same industry groups, but not necessarily the same people that expressed those interests today about no civil action and a right to cure, and effectively drafted a compromise where we left a civil action in place, but with an extensive ability to cure. And the reason we left a civil action in place is all of the other states that are passing this have massively staffed AG offices capable of implementing large consumer protection operations. The California Consumer Protection Act created an entirely new division of people, massive division. There is no way the state of Wyoming is going to hire enough people to actively enforce consumer protection sufficient to justify a denial of a right to access for civil disputes. So the cure, a lot of work went into, again, with industry representatives to get them so that while they weren't necessarily supportive of a private right of action, the cure language was strong. And I think it's an appropriate balance that works for the state of Wyoming. Either that, or we can try and convince the rest of the legislature to hire 8 consumer protection specialists into the AG's office. Go ahead and raise your hand if you want to do that.
Mr. Co-Chair, that might be a tough sell. Plus,
I
you like empowering the little guy here. Committee members, is there any heartburn with at least proceeding conceptually? Sensing none. That does leave us with the idea of a digital lien registry that we had talked about before. I still sense that we're still not all quite on the same page, Mr. Revelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had the sense that we were on the same page, but we just don't know quite what the page looks like. Maybe just to rephrase that, I didn't sense that there was objection to the idea. In principle, it's just, is it simply a public notification vehicle, or is there something more? But I think we've got, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Kaufman, I think we have a general idea of what we'd like to do. And have, unfortunately, we had some attorneys lined up who were the ones that sort of outlined this idea, lined up to speak with us, but they were not available at that time. So that could be a source of assistance here as well for getting started, as well as Mr. Land in Senator Lummis's office has some thoughts.
David, I know we had chatted about this previously. What additional questions or directives or guidance do you need?
Mr. Chairman, based on our conversations, my understanding of the request at this point, and it certainly could be flawed, but my understanding of the request at this point would be to create a new section kind of modeled after the Digital Asset Registration Act that would allow a person to identify a digital asset and assert that they have a lien against that asset. And that would be registered with the Secretary of State, but otherwise would not provide any legal rights. It would not override any of the UCC stuff. It would basically just be a statement that I've got a lien against this asset that would be registered with the Secretary of State. Now, again, that could be flawed based on the conversation, a lot of back and forth. So if there's something else that needs to be in there, please let me know.
Mr. Kaufman?
So, Mr. Chairman, I think that's in my mind pretty much right. I just wanted to clarify, because the UCC filing system of the Secretary of State's office now doesn't really prioritize or qualify assertions of lien rights, right? It's just a filing repository. So I just want to be clear that I think in that respect, we're doing the same thing as what you would do with filing a UCC statement. It's just as you just outlined, particularly for digital assets. There was that question that Ms. Long brought up with respect to the potential conflict of Article 12. And I think maybe that's where we got a little bit snagged with respect to her comments. I don't know enough about Article 12, frankly, to opine on that, but I think that's what Joel was just suggesting, that we could probably go down that path. I think that's what everybody was suggesting. And maybe we can call in some folks once we have a draft to parse out these finer UCC points. But I think that what you just outlined is correct.
Mr. Kaufman, I would agree. I think it certainly sounds right in terms of the conversation we had. It makes sense. I also think that, and Mr. Co-Chair, feel free to weigh in. It's not going to hurt to at least get a bill draft going and give us something to look at. And if we have to come back and revise it and edit it, or maybe we just drop the whole thing entirely, I think it would be at least be worthwhile to get a bill draft going and go from there. Committee members, any heartburn over this one? Doesn't look like it, so. Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't there for the conversation, but I remember the earlier conversation about it, and I think it's worth pursuing. It sounds like the model of emulating the Digital Asset Registration Act. It makes a lot of sense if we want a cryptographically signed registration process, and that's appropriate for digital asset liens. So somebody will provide some attestation, provide a registry, and that seems like a good approach. I think providing some flexibility to Mr. Hopkinson, which I assume we would certainly do, to work with stakeholders and flex on that draft a little bit if it's not perfect, is generally how we roll. So I'm sure it will turn out well and we'll end up with a good draft in September.
Excellent. I think feel good about that one.
Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, Mr. Revelle. Or sorry, let's go ahead with Mr. Revelle first, and then let's do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to offer again that there were two attorneys that had sort of brought this idea forward that I think may have some thoughts that I would be happy to put in touch with LSO. They've offered their services. If that would be of assistance, happy to do that.
I think that would be appreciated. Excellent. Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to ask about, again, I'm sorry to have missed the discussion with the Secretary of State's office on their progress with the digital asset registration system, but I know we'll obviously want to work with them as we draft and make sure that we meet their resource interests on whatever they're going to need. So we'll have to double check and visit with them. We had an appropriation associated with the Digital Asset Registration Act, and we'll probably need to find out what that will be to add additional functionality to that system so that it reflects this new capability. And I would ask, was there anything else that came up in that discussion with the Secretary of State's office that might be worthwhile for us to draft towards? And was there discussion about the cryptographic corporate filing system that we could take action on?
Mr. Kaufman.
I jumped the gun, Mr. Chairman. Not on the cryptographic one, but there was one other that we spoke about that I failed to mention the Secretary of State's office. I don't know if you want me to discuss that one briefly or not. The filing issue.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, let's go ahead and you can touch on if you'd like, Mr. Kaufman, go ahead.
So Mr. Co-Chairs, the idea here was, and I have spoken to the Secretary of State's office about this, we forgot to bring it up. But Delaware and a number of other states have expedited filing mechanisms, which Wyoming does not have. And this has come up a number of times, particularly amongst the legal community. I'll give you a quick example. When an attorney is filing like a merger, you file articles of merger, and that merger has to be processed and filed with a certain merger date. For publicly traded companies or companies that are obtaining financing for that deal, they need a date certain. And currently our Secretary of State rules don't allow them to process that with a date certain. So you have to coordinate that. It's a small thing, but it's a competitive disadvantage to Delaware for sure. So we did speak to the Secretary of State's office. They were very open and amenable to the idea. The idea is simply a very simple statutory authorization under their current authorizing statute to allow them to incorporate expedited filing. That's it. To give you an idea, like Nevada has this, you can do same day filing, 24-hour filing, and pay like $1,000. Or the regular filing fee of $100. So Delaware has the same thing. I think they have maybe a 2 or 3 day expedited filing, and then they have a same day or 24-hour expedited filing with just heightened fees. So again, something our Secretary of State's office has expressed very much a willingness to do. We just don't have it. I don't know why we don't have it, but that was it.
I think it seems pretty straightforward. Mr. Co-Chair, do you have anything you want to tack onto that?
Mr. Chairman, that was something that I did discuss with Mr. Kaufman a while back. I think it's an exceptional idea. The only concern I would have is that it might be appropriate for the Corporations Committee, but I think we should put in a drafting request for it. This is like a 1-pager, maybe a 2-pager. Get this started and then talk to our colleagues over in the Corporations Committee about whether they'd rather shepherd that or us. But someone needs to take it across the finish line. It seems like it's a no-brainer bill with no complexity, just an authorization to ensure that we're meeting the needs of our business folks, and they don't have the authority to actually expedite anything. Nothing can go up to the top of the stack for a few extra dollars. Doesn't make any sense. So I think we should get that bill draft. But let's reach out to Corporations Committee and talk to them.
Sure. I agree. Let's at least get the ball rolling on that. I think, again, it would be pretty simple. Committee, any heartburns? Heartburn on that one? Doesn't seem like it. Mr. Co-Chair, what was the other one you mentioned? It escapes me right now.
Oh, my apologies. Just the overall corporate filing system that we've been trying to implement through the Secretary of State's office. A fully API-driven, cryptographically enabled blockchain corporate filing system for as long as you and I have been involved in this process, any of us. And I don't know if there was discussion, since I didn't participate this morning on that. We don't have to address it at this point if there wasn't significant discussion, but something we might want to consider putting a budget amendment together for, and we can talk about that at a later meeting to facilitate it.
Mr. Chairman, there was not a ton of dialogue. A lot of it got pulled into the Digital Asset Registry Act, the rulemaking, all that kind of stuff, and the vendors that they're working with. And just, an update from Colin Crossman on the status of that. But we can certainly, maybe for our next meeting, that can be a potential option as well, whether it's a budget amendment or a formal bill. But I think absolutely it's needed. If we're business friendly, it's most definitely needed. I think kind of the last one, at least it comes to my mind, was if we want any draft legislation on our discussion on AI. Dazza had mentioned something along the lines of, if you're interacting with AI, if an individual has the right, if they ask them to be given the correct answer. That was just something he had mentioned, obviously, but it's a really big one as well. And I'm not sure if we do want to proceed with any kind of draft. Mr. Co-Chair, what do you think?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if we know enough yet. The other one that comes to mind is the, announcing a deep fake as an example, or announcing that AI was used, requirements there. But I don't know exactly what that draft would look like. I think we need to iterate through that and get that group of experts assembled between now and our next meeting, and maybe they can iterate through some ideas on what we should be doing and see if something can coalesce. So I think maybe we need a little more time on that.
Mr. Co-Chair, I think you're probably right. Again, it's such a giant nebulous topic. It's kind of like the data privacy stuff. It's got where to begin, right? And I think maybe it might be worthwhile to let this develop a little bit more. Committee members, is there anything else that we're missing out on? Representative Andrew, Senator Furphy, Representative Singh. Well, with that, we are Mr. Co-Chair, anything else?
Mr. Chairman, just thanks to the committee, obviously, thanks to our staff for their exceptional continued work and all of the stakeholders that join us from around the world to make this process go forward smoothly. We look forward to working with everybody again this year and continuing to refine the products that we're putting out to enable this blockchain and financial technology sector. So great work, everybody, and look forward to, the next few months putting together some good legislation here. Thanks, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Again, thank you very much for our staff. It's, we cover a lot of ground. You guys do a really good job tracking us. So thank you. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.